The autumn wind whistled through the empty grocery store parking lot as Marcus Williams trudged home from basketball practice. His muscles ached from the extra drills Coach Thompson had put them through, preparing for the upcoming championship game. The same game Marcus worried he might not even play in, given the sorry state of his worn-out sneakers. He paused near the cart return, fishing through his pockets to count his savings one more time. $23.47, barely enough for a decent meal, let alone the $120 shoes he needed. The other kids on the team had already noticed the duct tape holding his current pair together, their snickers growing louder with each passing practice. That's when something caught his eye. A splash of brown leather against the gray concrete, nestled between the yellow parking line and the curb. Marcus approached cautiously, his heart quickening as he realized what it was. A wallet, and not a cheap one either. The kind his mother would call genuine leather, with that longing tone she used when window shopping at the mall. The wind picked up, threatening to scatter the wallet's partially spilled contents across the lot. Marcus quickly gathered everything, his fingers trembling slightly as he discovered just how much the wallet contained. 3 credit cards, a driver's license showing a woman with carefully styled blonde hair, and beneath that, Marcus's breath caught. A stack of crisp bills that made his $23 feel like pocket change. He counted methodically, the way his mother had taught him to handle money. 20 20s, a 10, and 2 5s. $340. The equivalent of nearly 3 pairs of the basketball shoes he desperately needed. The license belonged to Sarah Henderson, with an address in Oak Hill, the part of town where houses had 3-car garages and swimming pools visible from Google Earth. Marcus pulled out his phone. Its screen cracked but still functional. Oak Hill was at least 30 minutes away by foot, in the opposite direction from his home. The bus would be faster, but that would mean spending some of his saved money. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since lunch. The temptation to just take the money flickered through his mind. It wasn't like Mrs. Henderson would miss it. Not with a house in Oak Hill. People like that probably lost more than this gambling at the casino his mom cleaned on weekends. He could leave the wallet with the cards at the customer service desk, claim he found it empty. No one would ever know. But Marcus would know. He'd know every time he laced up those new shoes. Every time he made a shot on the court. Every time his mother looked at him with that fierce pride that made him stand taller, even when things got tough. The same pride she'd shown last month when she turned down a promotion at the casino after discovering it would involve covering up certain financial discrepancies. Some things are worth more than money, she told him that night over their dinner of boxed mac and cheese. Like being able to look yourself in the mirror every morning. Marcus straightened up, tucking the wallet securely into his backpack. The sun was already starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. His mother would worry if he was too late getting home, but she'd understand once he explained. She always did. He pulled up the map on his phone, plotting the fastest route to Oak Hill. The wealthy neighborhood felt like a different world, one where people like Marcus usually only appeared wearing service uniforms or making deliveries. But today, he had a different purpose. He adjusted his backpack, took a deep breath, and started walking north, leaving the familiar comfort of his neighborhood behind. The weight of the wallet seemed to grow heavier with each step Marcus took. He found himself stopping at a bus shelter, its plastic walls covered in graffiti and faded advertisements for local businesses. The metal bench offered a moment's rest, and more dangerously, a chance to think. $340. The number danced in his mind like a taunt. Not just enough for the basketball shoes he needed, but enough to buy his little sister the winter coat she'd been eyeing at the thrift store, with plenty left over for groceries. His mother had been cutting her own hours at the casino to attend night classes, hoping to earn her associate's degree. Every dollar mattered these days. Marcus pulled out the wallet again, his fingers tracing the expensive leather. Mrs. Henderson's driver's license showed a woman with perfectly manicured nails and pearls around her neck. The kind of person who probably had more wallets at home, Who could replace $300 with a quick trip to the ATM? The kind of person who'd never understand what that amount meant to a family like his. His phone buzzed. A text from his mother. Everything okay? Running late. The concern in those simple words made his chest tighten. She trusted him, always had. Even when his father left 6 years ago, taking their savings and leaving nothing but empty promises, his mother had turned to 13-year-old Marcus and said, "At least I know I can always count on you." The memory of that moment crystallized his decision. Marcus stood up, shoving away the whispers of temptation that had momentarily clouded his judgment. He typed a quick reply to his mother. "Found someone's lost wallet. Going to return it. Will explain later." Her response came almost immediately. "That's my boy. Be safe. Love you." As he waited for the map to load on his phone, Marcus noticed a small photo that had slipped between the wallet's credit cards. It showed a younger Mrs. Henderson holding a little girl, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. The girl couldn't have been more than 5, wearing the kind of frilly dress his sister dreamed about. They looked happy, human. Not just symbols of wealth and privilege, but real people who could feel loss and worry too. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as Marcus crossed the invisible boundary into Oak Hill. The change was immediate and stark. Sidewalks became wider and immaculately maintained. Trees stood in perfectly spaced rows, and houses loomed like small castles behind manicured lawns. A couple power walking in matching athleisure wear gave him a suspicious glance, and Marcus felt his shoulders tense. He'd been here once before, 2 years ago, when his basketball team made it to the finals. The game was played at Oak Hill's state-of-the-art gymnasium, and he remembered the awe he'd felt at the pristine facilities. That same evening, he'd overheard 2 Oak Hill parents complaining about those kids being boozed in from his neighborhood. Now, walking these streets alone, Marcus understood why his mother always insisted he carry his school ID and keep his receipts when shopping. One wrong move, one misunderstanding, and he'd be answering questions from people who'd already made up their minds about who he was and why he was here. But he kept walking, his mother's words from countless conversations echoing in his mind. "Your character is what you do when no one's watching." Well, people were definitely watching now, but that didn't change what was right. The Henderson house was just 2 blocks away, according to his phone. Marcus squared his shoulders and picked up his pace, the wallet secure in his backpack, his decision even more secure in his heart. The Henderson residence stood like a fortress of brick and colonial columns, its windows gleaming in the fading daylight. Marcus paused at the foot of the circular driveway, taking in the 3-car garage, the perfectly trimmed copiaries, and the small placard that warned of an active security system. A sleek BMW sat in the driveway, its presence somehow making him even more conscious of his scuffed sneakers and practice-worn basketball shorts. The doorbell's chime echoed somewhere deep within the house, not the simple electronic buzz he was used to, but a melodic sequence that sounded like something from a church. Marcus shifted his weight from one foot to the other, suddenly aware of the security camera mounted discreetly above the door. Its small red light blinked steadily, recording his every movement. Footsteps approached from inside, the sharp click of heels on hardwood. Marcus straightened his posture, the way his mother had taught him for job interviews. "Shoulders back, head high," she always said. "Being poor doesn't mean being less than." The door opened, and Marcus found himself face to face with Sarah Henderson. She looked exactly like her driver's license photo, but somehow more imposing in person. Her blonde hair was swept into an elegant twist, her pearls catching the light as she took an almost imperceptible step backward. Her eyes widened slightly, darting past him to scan the empty driveway, then to his backpack, and finally settling on his face with poorly concealed apprehension. "Can I help you?" Her voice was tight, controlled, one hand remaining firmly on the door, as if ready to slam it shut at a moment's notice. The smell of something baking wafted from inside, cookies or bread, the kind of homey scent that should have been welcoming, but instead highlighted the invisible barrier between them. Marcus unzipped his backpack slowly, deliberately, keeping his movements calm and visible. "Mrs. Henderson, I found your wallet in the grocery store parking lot." He carefully extracted the brown leather wallet, holding it out like a peace offering. "I wanted to make sure you got it back safely." The change in her expression was subtle, surprise mixing with something else, perhaps embarrassment or disbelief. She reached for the wallet, her manicured fingers brushing against his briefly as she took it. Marcus noticed she was wearing the same pearl bracelet from the photo with her daughter, the one where they both looked so happy and carefree. "Oh," she said, opening the wallet and rifling through its contents. Her movements were quick, almost frantic, as if she couldn't believe everything was still there. I didn't even realize I'd lost it." "Where did you say you found it?" "The Mason Street Market parking lot," Marcus replied, maintaining eye contact despite her nervous glances. Everything should be there. Credit cards, cash, photos. He wanted to ask about the little girl in the picture, to somehow bridge the chasm of assumptions between them, but Mrs. Henderson's body language made it clear this interaction was already longer than she wanted. "Well, thank you," she said curtly, already stepping back into her house. The warmth of the baking smell was replaced by the artificial freshness of air conditioning as she widened the gap between them. That was, she paused, seemingly searching for the right word, unexpected. The door closed with a solid thunk before Marcus could respond. Through the decorative glass panels, he watched her figure retreat quickly into the depths of the house, the wallet clutched tightly to her chest. The security camera's red light continued its steady blinking, recording his slow turn away from the door, his measured steps back down the pristine driveway. As he reached the sidewalk, Marcus heard the distinctive sound of a deadbolt being engaged behind him. The sun had nearly set now, casting long shadows across Oak Hill's perfect lawns. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and an automatic sprinkler system whirred to life. Marcus began his long walk home, unaware that this seemingly simple act of honesty was about to spark a chain of events that would change multiple lives forever. The kitchen in Marcus's apartment filled with the aroma of his mother's signature meatloaf, a rare treat she reserved for days when the casino tips were good. Tonight, though, the familiar comfort of their dinner routine felt different. Marcus pushed his green beans around his plate, his mind still stuck on the cold reception at the Henderson house. "Baby, you've barely touched your food," Lisa Williams said, studying her son's face with the kind of attention that only mothers seemed to master. She changed out of her casino uniform, but exhaustion still clung to the corners of her eyes. "Did something else happen when you returned that wallet?" Marcus set his fork down, the metal clicking against the chipped plate. "It was weird, Mom. Mrs. Henderson looked at me like I was..." He trailed off, searching for the right words. "Like I was a threat, not someone trying to help. She barely said thank you before shutting the door in my face." His mother's expression shifted, a complex mix of hurt, understanding, and resignation crossing her features. "Some people see what they expect to see," she said softly, reaching across their small table to squeeze his hand. "But you did the right thing, Marcus. That's what matters." The moment was interrupted by his little sister, Tanya, bouncing into the kitchen with her tablet. "Mom, can you help me with my science project? We're studying." She stopped short, picking up on the tension in the room. At 11, she was already learning to read the unspoken currents that ran through their family conversations. Lisa was about to respond when 3 sharp knocks echoed through the apartment. They weren't the usual casual taps of a neighbor asking to borrow sugar or complaining about the building's temperamental heating system. These knocks carried authority, demanding attention. Marcus's heart jumped into his throat as his mother rose from the table. Through their thin walls, they could hear Mrs. Johnson next door, peeping through her door's viewfinder. Lisa straightened her shirt and walked to the door, her posture shifting into what Marcus recognized as her dealing with authority stance. 2 police officers stood in the hallway, their badges catching the flickering fluorescent light. The taller one had a notebook already in hand, while his partner's eyes scanned the apartment's interior, lingering on Marcus at the dinner table. "Good evening, ma'am," the taller officer said, his tone professionally neutral. "I'm Officer Roberts. This is Officer Chen. We're following up on an incident that occurred earlier today. Is your son Marcus Williams?" Lisa's hand gripped the doorframe, her knuckles whitening slightly. "Yes, he is. May I ask what this is about?" "We received a report regarding a wallet that was returned to a resident in Oak Hill," Officer Chen explained, her gaze now fixed on Marcus. "We'd like to ask him a few questions." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crack the worn linoleum beneath their feet. Tanya had frozen in her chair, her tablet forgotten. Through the walls, they could hear Mrs. Johnson's television suddenly go quiet. The whole floor would know about this by morning. "My son found a wallet and returned it," Lisa said, her voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "He did the right thing." "We're just following up on the owner's concerns," Officer Roberts said, flipping open his notebook. "Standard procedure. May we come in?" Lisa stepped back, not in submission but with the calculated grace of someone choosing their battles. "Marcus," she called, though she didn't take her eyes off the officers, "come sit with me on the couch. Tanya, go to your room and finish your homework." As Marcus stood, his legs feeling like lead, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the darkened window. Behind him, the kitchen table still held their half-eaten dinner, steam no longer rising from the plates that now served as props in a scene he never imagined his honesty would create. The living room felt smaller with the two officers occupying their second-hand armchair. Officer Roberts balanced his notebook on his knee while Officer Chen remained standing, positioned near the doorway, as if anticipating a need for quick movement. The wall clock ticked loudly in the uncomfortable silence, its sound mixing with the muffled music from Tanya's room, her way of pretending she couldn't hear what was happening. "So, Marcus," Officer Roberts began, his pen hovering over the notepad, "walk us through exactly what happened when you found Mrs. Henderson's wallet." Lisa sat close to Marcus on the couch, their shoulders touching. The contact grounded him, reminded him of all the talks they'd had about staying calm in situations like this. "I was walking home from basketball practice," Marcus began, his voice steadied despite his racing heart. "I found the wallet in the Mason Street Market parking lot, near the cart return." "And you immediately looked inside," Officer Chen interjected, her tone suggesting this was somehow suspicious. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied. "I needed to find out who it belonged to so I could return it." Officer Roberts scribbled something down. "Mrs. Henderson reports that when she checked her wallet after you left, she noticed some money was missing. She distinctly remembers having more cash than what was returned." Lisa's body tensed beside Marcus, but her voice remained controlled. "Did Mrs. Henderson count her money before losing the wallet? Can she be certain of the exact amount?" The officers exchanged glances. Officer Chen cleared her throat. "We have surveillance footage from the grocery store parking lot showing your son picking up the wallet." "Good," Lisa said firmly. "Then you can see he didn't take anything from it." "The footage isn't clear enough to show that level of detail," Officer Roberts admitted. "But given the circumstances—" "What circumstances?" Lisa interrupted, her patience finally showing cracks. "The circumstance of my son doing the right thing, or the circumstance of him being black in Oak Hill." The room crackled with tension. Through the wall, Tanya's music stopped abruptly. Even Mrs. Johnson's television next door seemed to grow quieter. Officer Chen stepped forward, her expression softening slightly. "Mrs. Williams, we're just following protocol. Several $100s is missing, and we have to investigate." Marcus felt his mother's hand find his, squeezing gently. The gesture reminded him of all the times she'd held his hand through difficult moments, his father leaving, changing schools, facing discrimination at his first basketball game in the suburbs. Her touch said what words couldn't. "I believe in you. Stand tall. I can tell you exactly what was in that wallet," Marcus said, lifting his chin. 3 credit cards, a driver's license, a photo of Mrs. Henderson with a little girl, and $340. 2020s, 110, and 2 5s. The specificity of his answers seemed to catch the officers off guard. Officer Roberts' pen paused mid-sentence. "That's very detailed," Officer Chen said slowly. "I counted carefully," Marcus explained. "My mom taught me to always handle other people's property with extra care. That's also why I noticed the pearls Mrs. Henderson was wearing in her license photo matched the bracelet she had on today." Lisa straightened beside him. "My son walks 30 minutes to return a wallet, makes sure to note every detail so nothing can be questioned, and this is his reward: being treated like a criminal in his own home." Officer Roberts closed his notebook, something shifting in his expression. "Mrs. Williams, we're not." A sharp knock on the apartment door cut him off. Officer Chen moved to answer it, revealing a slightly disheveled man in an expensive suit, his tie loosened and his face flushed with what appeared to be embarrassment. "I'm James Henderson," he announced, stepping into the already crowded room. "And I believe we owe your son an apology." James Henderson's entrance seemed to pull all the oxygen from the room. His expensive suit looked rumpled, as if he'd rushed home from somewhere important, and his face carried the burden of someone who'd just discovered an uncomfortable truth. Behind him, lurking in the hallway, stood Mrs. Henderson, her earlier confidence replaced by visible distress. "Sarah," James said, turning to his wife, "you need to tell them what you just told me." When she hesitated, he added more firmly, "All of it." Mrs. Henderson stepped into the apartment, her eyes fixed on the worn carpet. Gone was the imperious woman who had barely thanked Marcus earlier that day. In her place stood someone smaller, more human, wrestling with her own prejudices. She began, then faltered. Her hand went to her pearl necklace, fidgeting with it nervously. "I made a terrible mistake. The money wasn't stolen. James had taken $400 from my wallet yesterday for the contractor, but I'd forgotten about it." Officer Roberts and Officer Chen exchanged glances. The notebook that had seemed so important moments ago now hung limply in Roberts' hand. Chen's professional mask cracked slightly, revealing a flash of disappointment, not in the case, but in how quickly they'd acted on assumptions. "When I saw some money was missing," Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "I jumped to conclusions. Horrible, unfair conclusions. I didn't even count what was left properly. She gestured helplessly. "I just saw him, and you saw what you expected to see." Lisa finished for her, echoing her earlier words to Marcus, but now they carried the weight of decades of similar experiences. James Henderson stepped forward, his presence filling the small living room. "I was in Phoenix when Sarah called about sending the police. I caught the first flight back when she mentioned a young man returning her wallet. I knew," he paused, running a hand through his graying hair, "I knew I had taken that money, and I realized what had happened." Marcus sat quietly, processing the scene unfolding before him. The same people who had viewed him as a threat hours ago were now standing in his living room, their privileged world colliding with his in a way that stripped away their usual defenses. Tanya's door creaked open slightly, her curiosity finally overwhelming her attempt to stay hidden. The sound seemed to snap Officer Roberts back to protocol mode. "Given this new information," he said, clearing his throat, "we'll obviously be closing this investigation immediately." "Closing the investigation isn't enough," James Henderson said firmly. He turned to Marcus and Lisa, his face etched with genuine regret. "The way you've been treated, the assumptions, the accusations, the police involvement, it's unacceptable. We owe you much more than a simple apology." Mrs. Henderson finally lifted her eyes to meet Marcus. "When you returned my wallet, I was so caught up in my own prejudices that I couldn't see what was right in front of me. A young man of extraordinary character. I saw the photo of my daughter and me in the wallet when I checked it later. You could have easily taken it, along with everything else, but you didn't. You even noticed the connection between that photo and my bracelet. The wall clock continued its steady ticking, marking the moments of this unexpected confrontation with reality. Through the window, the street lights had come on, casting long shadows across the room. Mrs. Johnson's television next door had gone completely silent now, the whole building seeming to hold its breath. "I don't know how to make this right," Mrs. Henderson admitted, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "But I need to try. We need to try." James Henderson nodded, squaring his shoulders as if preparing to lift a heavy burden. "And we're going to start right now." The following morning arrived with a gentle rain, droplets racing down the apartment windows as Marcus sat at the kitchen table, attempting to focus on his breakfast. The events of the previous night felt almost dreamlike, but the business card Mr. Henderson had left, embossed with Henderson Tech Solutions in silver lettering, proved it had all been real. A knock at the door made Marcus and his mother exchange glances. They weren't expecting the Hendersons for another hour, yet there they stood, Sarah and James Henderson, looking somehow both more and less imposing in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the apartment hallway. Sarah clutched a large paper bag from an upscale bakery, while James carried what appeared to be a leather portfolio. "We hope we're not too early," Sarah said, her voice softer than the previous day. The pearls were gone, replaced by a simple silver necklace. "I couldn't sleep much last night, thinking about everything." Lisa welcomed them in with the grace she always showed, despite the circumstances. Tanya peeked out from her room, curious about the morning's visitors, and this time Sarah's face lit up with genuine warmth. "You must be Tanya," she said, holding up the bakery bag. "I brought breakfast pastries. My daughter Emma loves their chocolate croissants." The mention of her daughter seemed to crack something in Sarah's carefully maintained composure. She turned to Marcus, who had risen from the kitchen table. "I kept thinking about Emma last night," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "She's just a little younger than your sister. If someone had found her photo in a lost wallet and returned it safely, I would have been grateful, not suspicious. Instead, I let fear and prejudice cloud my judgment so completely that I risked ruining a young man's life." James stepped forward, placing his portfolio on the table. "We spent most of the night talking," he said, looking between Marcus and Lisa, "about privilege, about assumptions, about the world we've created where a simple act of kindness becomes suspicious based on the color of someone's skin." He opened the portfolio, revealing several documents. "We can't change society overnight, but we can start making changes in our own sphere of influence." Sarah had moved to sit near Tanya, who was already happily exploring the bakery bag. The simple human interaction, a shared smile over pastries, stood in stark contrast to yesterday's cold encounter at the Hendersons' door. "First," James continued, "I've already called the police department to formally withdraw the complaint and make it clear that Marcus acted with complete integrity. I've also requested a meeting with the chief to discuss how such situations are handled in the future." Lisa nodded, her hand finding Marcus's shoulder. "That's appreciated, but unnecessary. We're used to." "That's exactly the problem," Sarah interrupted, surprising everyone with her vehemence. "You shouldn't be used to any of this, which brings us to the second part." James pulled out another document. "I run a technology company that's been trying to diversify our internship program for years. Marcus, your mother mentioned last night that you're interested in both sports and computers. We'd like to offer you a paid internship, starting this summer. Real experience, real responsibility, real opportunity." Marcus felt his heart skip a beat, but his mother's grip on his shoulder tightened slightly. "Mr. Henderson," she began carefully, "while we appreciate the offer, we don't want charity born of guilt." "This isn't charity," James replied firmly. "This is investment in talent." In fact, he glanced at his wife, who nodded encouragingly. "We'd like to establish a proper foundation, with Marcus as our first recipient. Not just an internship, but a full scholarship program for promising students who might otherwise be overlooked or unfairly judged." Sarah stood up, brushing pastry crumbs from her hands. "We can't undo what happened yesterday," she said softly. "But we can learn from it. We can grow. We can change." 3 months later, Marcus stood in front of Henderson Tech Solutions, adjusting the collar of his new polo shirt. The company logo felt crisp against his chest, a tangible reminder of how much had changed since that day in the parking lot. His new basketball shoes, purchased with his first internship paycheck, squeaked slightly against the polished lobby floor. Inside, he found himself sharing the elevator with Sarah Henderson. The awkwardness of their first encounter had gradually transformed into something unexpected, a mentorship of sorts. She'd been true to her word about changing, throwing herself into the Scholarship Foundation's development with the same intensity she'd once directed at protecting her privileged world. "Ready for the big presentation?" she asked, her smile genuine. The Foundation's first fundraising event was scheduled for that evening, and Marcus would be speaking about his experience. "Emma's excited to see you. She's been practicing her introduction speech all week." The mention of Emma brought a smile to Marcus's face. The Hendersons' daughter had become a frequent visitor to his family's apartment, often joining Tanya for study sessions. Their friendship had developed naturally, untainted by the prejudices that had initially clouded their parents' interactions. The elevator opened to reveal a transformed office space. What had once been a sea of uniform faces now showed the first signs of real diversity. James Henderson had made good on his promise, extending the internship program to other students from Marcus's school. Today, 3 of his classmates were also starting their summer positions. "Marcus," James called from across the room. He was standing with Lisa, who had taken a day off from the casino to attend the presentation. She looked different too, more confident, wearing a new blazer she'd bought with her recent promotion. The night classes had paid off, and she now managed the casino's accounting department. "The reporter from the city paper just arrived," James informed them. "She's interested in covering the Foundation's launch. Marcus, would you mind sharing your story?" Marcus nodded, remembering how his mother had helped him prepare for this moment. "Just speak your truth," she'd said. "That's all anyone can ask." The conference room filled quickly with employees, community leaders, and students interested in future opportunities. Mrs. Johnson from next door sat proudly in the front row. She'd been hired as the Foundation's community liaison, her years of observing neighborhood dynamics now put to constructive use. As Marcus took the podium, he saw Officer Chen in the audience. She'd become an unexpected ally, working with the police department to implement new training procedures addressing implicit bias. Officer Roberts had retired, but not before writing a commendation letter for Marcus that now hung framed in the Foundation's office. 3 months ago, Marcus began, his voice steady. "I found a wallet in a parking lot. It was a simple moment that could have gone 2 very different ways. We could have let suspicion and prejudice drive us further apart, or we could choose to learn, to grow, to change." He paused, looking at the faces before him. Black, white, brown, young, old, from all parts of the city. What happened in my apartment that night wasn't just about clearing up a misunderstanding. It was about people choosing to face uncomfortable truths and do something about them. From her seat, Sarah Henderson dabbed at her eyes discreetly. Her pearls caught the light as she moved, the same ones from her driver's license photo, but they no longer seemed like a symbol of division. Instead, they reminded everyone present of how far they'd come and how far they still had to go. "Change doesn't happen in grand gestures," Marcus continued, echoing the conversations he'd had with both families over the past months. "It happens in small moments, in choices we make when faced with our own prejudices. It happens when we choose to see each other as people first, when we extend trust instead of suspicion, when we build bridges instead of walls." The room fell silent as his words sank in. Through the window, the late afternoon sun painted the city in shades of gold, no longer divided by invisible lines of prejudice, but united by the promise of what could be when people chose to do better, to be better, one small moment at a time.